Bannerman Castle. If you've ever been to New York City, you may have noticed a castle sitting in the middle of the water about 50 miles or 80 kilometers north of the city center. This place is known as Bannerman Castle, and it's long since been abandoned. The structure originated in the early 20th century, so it's not actually that old, but ever since it caught on fire in 1969, it has been abandoned. Bannerman Castle is named after a Scottish arms dealer who had been raised in Brooklyn and purchased the island that the castle now sits on. Construction began in 1900, and the castle was subsequently used to store military armaments. The whole point of building the castle on the small island was so that Francis Bannerman had a spot where he could keep his giant cache of weapons, seeing as he was one of the most successful buyers of military surplus in the United States. It seemed like a good choice, seeing as how nobody ever lived on the island before. The Native American people had even thought the island was haunted, so they never bothered setting foot on it. During the First World War, Bannerman Castle helped by selling uniforms, blankets, and even cannons to the United States government. And even when Francis Bannerman died in 1918, the castle still wasn't fully built. Unfortunately, 2 years after Francis's death, the powder room exploded, 200 tons of shell and powder blew apart the castle, and shortly after, it went into complete disrepair. Then, the fire of 1969 caused the castle to be completely abandoned and forgotten. It's still one of the most mysterious places in New York. Kaiokoi. Kaiokoi is a ghost village in Turkey with a mysterious past. This ghost village is located just a short distance from a popular resort town, and yet it lies deserted, lifeless, and its structures are crumbling into dust. At the beginning of the 19th century, the town was bustling. There were schools, shops, and many businesses. It was really a thriving community. It was also unique in that Greek people and Turkish people lived inside the village together. But then came the First World War and the ending of the Ottoman Empire. The Greeks attempted to occupy the region, there was turmoil, and the small town of Kayakoi was left in ruins. The Turkish people returning from war didn't want to settle there, and most of the Greek citizens were forced to flee. Then the few people still remaining ended up having to leave when a violent earthquake hit the town. Without anyone left, everything just kind of fell apart. The buildings were abandoned, the shops were forgotten, and the ghost village of Kayakoi was born. It's unclear whether anyone will live in this town again. UNESCO named Kayakoi a World Friendship and Peace Village in an attempt to make it appear more friendly. But it's still deserted and abandoned and filled with ghosts. Today, it's a popular tourist destination for those looking to catch a glimpse of paranormal activity at night, or just to see the remnants of a not-so-ancient town left to be consumed by nature. Fordlandia. Fordlandia is, without a doubt, the most intriguing place abandoned in recent history. It was created by Henry Ford, the automobile tycoon who invented the 40-hour workweek and the assembly line. In the late 1920s, Henry Ford wanted to produce his own rubber for his motors, and he decided to build his perfect vision of a company city in the jungles of Brazil. While at first glance, this makes absolutely no sense, if you look deeper, it also makes no sense. Henry Ford thought that he could impose the American way of life on assembly line workers from a vastly different culture. He built the city of Fordlandia, able to house 10,000 people. But of course, it's currently abandoned because Ford's utopia failed dramatically. At face value, it wasn't a horrible idea. Ford thought that by bringing American businesses to Brazil, he could boost the country's economy and hurtle it into the future. He thought he could build a city of tomorrow inside the jungle, and this would help to accelerate the country of Brazil into the modern generation. Ford gave the overseeing duties to a Norwegian sea captain who knew nothing about rubber trees, which isn't the smartest idea when crafting a city to process rubber. It was a complete disaster. In America, the employees who worked for Ford were making $5 a day. In Brazil, they made only 35 cents. Plus, the idea of building American houses in the jungle was ridiculous. The Brazilians made their dwellings above the ground for a good reason. It was to keep tropical insects out. American-style homes were not a good fit for the jungle. The workers also didn't appreciate that they were forced to wear American-style clothing, that they were denied alcohol, and that they weren't allowed to associate with women. Ford even tried to get the natives to square dance and participate in gardening. In any case, the workers revolted, the whole thing was a disaster, and Fordlandia ended in ruin. The remnants of Ford's ill-advised social experiment can still be found rotting away in the middle of the jungle, plagued by bugs and wild animals. Oh yeah, there's also about 2,000 squatters who may or may not be living in the ramshackle leftovers. Aside from the nonsense with his abandoned project, do you own any vehicles that bear his name? What do you think of Ford cars and trucks? Do you like them? Hate them? Prefer another brand? Tell me your opinion in the comment section below. Then remember to subscribe to Talltanic for another exciting video just like this one. Ross Island. Ross Island is yet another abandoned place with a bizarre and mysterious past. It's often been called the Island of Colonial Horrors. It was first occupied by British colonists who wished to set up a penal settlement to subdue Indian rebels. The settlement on the island was built mostly by inmates using forced labor. A luxurious bungalow was constructed for the commissioner with gables and shaded verandas. There was a Presbyterian church crafted with glass window panels brought in from Italy. There were tennis courts, swimming pools, and all manner of British luxuries. But as you can imagine, the colonial overlords of Ross Island lived much better than the inmates who began being moved to the island to be imprisoned. The island eventually became overrun with malaria, cholera, and other really nasty diseases. The British experimented on the prisoners with strange medical trials and experimental drugs. It was an absolute freak show. Luckily, the settlement of Ross Island only lasted until 1937, when it was closed. The island was then struck by a massive earthquake in 1941, causing 3,000 deaths. Just a year later, Japanese forces made their way to the Andaman Islands and the British were forced to flee. Ross Island was pillaged and vandalized by the Japanese. The Allied forces recaptured it in 1945, and from then on it was pretty much abandoned. A visit today will allow you to see the absolutely bizarre ruins overgrown by the jungle where the British colonists had once terrorized the indigenous population. Akso Station. Akso Station is an abandoned underground part of the Paris metro system. It's basically a ghost station. It's sitting right now on an unused connecting branch between two popular lines. The station was originally built in the 1920s, but before the construction had even ended, it was realized that the station would not be considered profitable. There has never been a single train called to Akso Station. Plus, the construction ended before any access points were created. This means you can't even reach Akso Station from the surface. It's essentially walled off and trapped underground. But this hasn't stopped the station from being ravaged by graffiti and vandals. It's unclear just how exactly a person could even end up at this station, considering it's inaccessible underground. But what makes Akso Station another strange piece of the extensive and wildly mysterious underground city beneath the streets of Paris that almost nobody knows about? The Ghost Tower of Saton. The Ghost Tower of Saton is one of the most iconic buildings in Bangkok, and yet it was never finished. And it's completely abandoned to this very day. The skyscraper should have been 49 stories tall and comprised of luxury condominiums. Instead, it's become a popular destination for urban explorers and tourists, despite the building being hazardous, full of potential danger, and illegal to enter. According to Insider Magazine, much of the structure is already crumbling, but for anyone who's been to Bangkok, you definitely know how impressive the skyline can be from such a tall vantage point, which makes it extremely tempting to explore as a tourist. What makes the Ghost Tower of Saton really mysterious is that it just refuses to get built. You can see the building immediately upon leaving the Sapan Taksin BTS SkyTrain station on your way to Skybar, and it sticks out like a sore thumb. It's also usually covered in advertisements. Somebody must still be making some kind of money from the building, considering there are almost always giant ads strung up on its exterior. As for the building's abandonment, construction actually came to a halt in 1997 during the Asian financial crisis. Since then, construction has never begun anew. And yes, the building is said to be haunted. The 43rd floor is said to be the most haunted, considering that back in 2014, the body of a backpacker was found there, dead under mysterious circumstances. The Toothlessberg. The Toothlessberg is one of the strangest abandoned places in all of Germany. It's also known as the Devil's Mountain. But what is this strange place? Well, it's an abandoned NSA spy station built by the United States on top of a buried Nazi college. This relic goes back to the Cold War, and it's located far above the skyline in West Berlin. The college that this giant abandoned tower is constructed on top of was a Nazi military training school designed by the chief architect of Hitler. The Allies tried to destroy it several times but failed and only managed to cover it with rubble instead. Rather than waste the space, the Americans built a giant listening device so they could gather intelligence during the Cold War on East Germany, which was, at the time, controlled by the Russians. The listening station stayed in effect until the fall of the Berlin Wall and the ending of the Cold War. The station was eventually abandoned in 1992. It went on to be used for air traffic control for civilian flights, but that didn't last very long. David Lynch tried to buy the site to be used as a happiness college for a bunch of hippies, but that deal fell through. And to this day, the Toothlessberg is still abandoned and stands as a reminder of our strange and violent history. Abandoned Desert Theater. The abandoned outdoor cinema located in the middle of the Sinai Desert in Egypt is one of the most mysterious places probably in the world. It's a totally bizarre sight to see in the otherwise barren and rocky desert. The cinema had allegedly been built at the start of the millennium by a French person who thought it was a brilliant idea. However, no film was ever shown in this abandoned cinema, and it just kind of rotted away to nothing. It was likely looted throughout the years, and the only thing remaining today are the shattered seats scattered throughout the sand. You can even find the movie theater on Google Earth. You can still see all the seats set up in a row, ready to watch a film that will never be shown. The Monsell Seaforts. The Monsell Army Seaforts are familiar to anyone who's ever Googled weird places. These seaforts were once used to protect the United Kingdom from German attack. The anti-aircraft tower forts were built in 1942, with each fort boasting 7 buildings surrounding a main command tower. But what really catches people's attention is that all the forts were built on stilts. It's a very cool idea, with catwalks connecting each building to the next. The forts had been built on land and then transported into the water, and today, some of them still stand. They had a successful time during the Second World War defending Britain from aerial attacks, but then in the 1950s, the forts were no longer needed, so they were decommissioned. One of the forts was hit by a ship, the remaining forts were taken over as a pirate radio station in the 1960s, and a group of strange people crafted a small micronation that cropped up out of nowhere, built inside of one of the forts in the 1970s. And in 2005, an artist decided to squat inside one of the forts and write a blog. Today, the forts are in various states of ruin. Entering them is not advised, considering you could die. It's also illegal. The Gary City Methodist Church. There's nothing quite more mysterious than an abandoned church. In Gary, Indiana, there is one of the most impressive Gothic ruins ever. The City Methodist Church was built in 1926 at a ridiculous cost of over $1 million. In today's money, that's $7 million. About half the money was donated by the United States Steel Corporation. The church was enormous, with ornate stonework, giant pillars, stained glass, and many other beautiful designs. In its prime, the church saw at least 2,000 congregants in any given day. But like everything else, the church fell into ruin. The steel industry collapsed, the small town of Gary lost much of its population, the upkeep of the grandiose church was too expensive, and by 1975 it was closed, abandoned, and within just a few years had been vandalized and thoroughly destroyed. For the next half-century, This church sat as a mysterious relic in the middle of the city of Gary. Why it's never been destroyed or repurposed is anybody's guess. These were some pretty incredible abandoned places. Which one would you love to visit if given the chance? Let me know how you feel in the comments, and thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, be sure to subscribe and come back soon.